Hi, before we get too far along, I want to acknowledge that I'm recording this lecture from the homeland of the 19 pueblos of New Mexico and many formerly mobile nations. You probably know this area as Albuquerque. However, land acknowledgements like this one are a beginning and not an end, and I encourage all of you who are not indigenous to learn about whose indigenous lands you're living on as a first step towards the repair work that must be done by settlers like myself in North America. My name is Paulina, and I'll be lecturing today about feminist archaeology. A bit about me, as I am a feminist archaeologist in theory and practice. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am of Filipino and Polish descent. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest and lower mainland regions of North America, which is unceded Coast Salish territory. My work as an archaeologist focuses on how place is involved in the teaching and learning of culture. Specifically, I use historical documents and geographic information systems, also known as GIS, to explore these questions. To interpret my work, one of the theoretical approaches I use is feminist theory. Feminist theory has its origins in feminist history, and if you like this introduction, there's a whole department that you can explore to learn more. That, of course, would be women, gender, and sexuality studies. I give a brief background on the history of feminism in America because feminist theory in archaeology co-evolved with that history and reflects those changes. This change in feminism is typically discussed as a succession of waves, and while not everyone agrees that this is an appropriate way to describe changes in gender-based activism and theory, it's the guiding tool I'm using for portions of this introduction. In the United States, we associate first-wave feminism with the late 19th and early 20th centuries that center around the fight for voting rights for white, cis, heterosexual women. It's also around this time that archaeology as a field is developing. In the 1930s, with the Great Depression, a huge amount of archaeological work is done by people of all backgrounds, including working-class Black women, although it's only recently that their contribution to fieldwork has been actively recognized. The second wave of feminism is typically associated with the 1970 women's liberation movement, with women entering the workforce in large numbers and demanding equal rights. Around this time, feminist theory begins to develop as an academic theoretical framework that anthropologists, archaeologists, and social scientists in related disciplines such as geography begin to apply. In the 1980s is when we start to see archaeology producing its first publications on the applicability of feminist theory to our practice. The article considered the start of feminist theory in American archaeology was published almost 40 years ago in 1984. This may seem surprising because even now, many archaeologists have a tendency to describe feminist theory as a new approach to the discipline, even though it is a long and well-established theoretical framework. Third wave feminism is associated with the introduction from Kimberly Crenshaw of the concept of intersectionality. This means that we can begin to incorporate more than gender into discussions of oppression in the past and present. While that work began in the 1990s, archaeologists didn't regularly incorporate these ideas until the 2000s. An important archaeological text that highlights intersectional work is that by Whitney Battle Baptiste called Black Feminist Archaeology. This work applies a Black feminist lens to doing archaeology of the recent past, occasionally referred to as historical archaeology, and has been followed by publications such as that by Catherine Sterling. Sterling's work looks specifically at how we can use Black feminist theory, which looks at the intersection of race and gender, to understand relationships between anatomically modern humans and Neanderthals who lived in possibly mixed households but definitely raised children of mixed race. We are currently in the fourth wave of feminism associated with the internet age and sometimes the Me Too movement. I'm intrigued to see how these new perspectives will change archaeological theory in the future, probably in the next 5 to 10 years. One of the first critiques that feminist approaches had of archaeology was the assumption that science was objective. While we as scientists attempt to get at objectivity in a variety of ways, measuring things multiple times or attempting to disprove hypotheses in multiple ways, pure objectivity is just not possible. Why? Because we're humans before we are scientists, and therefore we are imperfect sensors for whatever we're trying to understand. This generally translates into an understanding that who we are and what we know influences our ability to interpret the archaeological record, but it also influences the kinds of questions we ask and how we design our research projects. Initial feminist approaches in archaeology focused on critiquing and interrogating five main problems in archaeology: androcentrism, gendered assumptions about the past; ethnocentrism, singular explanations for patterns in material culture; and time-centrism. These critiques continue to be issues until today, but were the main topics of discussion in the 1984 piece Archaeology and the Study of Gender. For definitions of these topics, I encourage you to pause and review this slide. The issue with all of these perspectives is that predominantly male archaeologists did not acknowledge how their personal bias and lack of knowledge impacted the questions they asked, the theories that they used, and the subjects that they felt were worthy of study. Specifically, questions were asked almost exclusively about male or masculinely gendered activities, things like hunting and public life, while ignoring tasks like cooking and childcare, typically gendered femininely, by literally not investigating them. And this gap extended into the types of theoretical frameworks that archaeologists use. For example, a major theoretical framework that we use is called ethnographic analogy. However, ethnographers for a significant amount of time ignore the practices or activities that women did in traditional societies. How then were archaeologists supposed to interpret the material culture associated with those activities without an adequate description of what women, children, the elderly, or people outside of a Western gender binary did in those societies? These critiques also applied not only to our interpretation of the archaeological record, but also to the practice of archaeology. What do we think an archaeologist looks like? Although Black women have actively participated in archaeological fieldwork since the early 20th century, during the first wave of feminism, Black women are not regularly seen as the average archaeologist and have historically been barred from participation in the field because of institutional racism. Who is supposed to do lab work versus field work? People have assumed that I don't like field work without asking me or knowing anything about my interests in archaeology. Instead, they make assumptions about me based on my size and my gender. I find this really ironic because one of the things that draws me to archaeology is the combination of fieldwork, getting to see amazing, beautiful places and drive through great landscapes, with the combination of computer-based modeling techniques. In general, feminist approaches make us explore our bias and encourage archaeologists to look at all aspects of people's lives, not just the experiences of able-bodied adult men. So what does a feminist archaeology look like? A feminist archaeology often asks us to examine how our own position in relation to our subjects of study may influence what we ask and why. That's why I let all of you know at the beginning of the talk a little bit about myself, so that you can consider how my identity might influence what I study and why. It also looks like asking questions about people's home lives and their families and their daily activities. How did people cook in the past? Who was involved in the process? And where did they get the materials for making fires for cooking and for the vessels that they were actually cooking in? What sorts of non-hunted foods were part of their diet on a regular basis? And what did a cooking vessel mean to different people in the past? Was this bowl made by an expert potter who was someone's close friend or family member? But it seems to be decorated kind of sloppily, so maybe parts of it were made by someone's child. Did someone have a sentimental attachment to it because it was made by their favorite kid friend? Or was it just one of many vessels that they had at their disposal? It also looks like thinking about how the conclusions we have from archaeology are talked about when we discuss things with the public and other communities. Am I giving a lecture in front of a classroom and demanding that everyone in the room assume that I'm the only expert on the topic? Or are we all discussing these conclusions in a group, allowing multiple voices from many stakeholding groups, particularly from descendant communities, to come forward to interpret and understand the findings in different ways? In conclusion, feminist archaeology is interested in dispelling the hegemonic application of an androcentric archaeology and incorporating feminist theory into the discipline. It does this by considering different conceptions of power within past societies, but also considering different conceptions of power in the way that we actually disseminate the knowledge we have about the archaeological record. We do this by understanding different types of information and ways of understanding expertise. Who do we listen to and why? Feminist archaeology also involves investigating and understanding questions about the household, people of many genders and many ages, to actually build a full picture of what the past was like as a subjectively lived experience. It acknowledges and encourages the explanation of artifacts and patterns in material culture in multiple ways to acknowledge that subjectivity. Also, as a practice, it encourages accountability, reflexivity, and an examination of archaeology from people who have historically been barred from participating in the field as an academic practice. People of many genders and many races have always been part of archaeology, but their stories and contributions have not always been acknowledged. If you were intrigued by some of the work that I mentioned in this introduction, here is a short list of further readings and pieces I mentioned in this talk. Please feel free to reach out to me with questions by asking your instructor for my contact information. Thank you so much for your time and enjoy your day.